Hello everyone, I am Dr. Deepa. Today we will be learning about the pharynx. In the previous video, we have discussed about the nasopharynx. We will learn in detail about the oro and the laryngopharynx in this video for today. As we all very well know, the pharynx is a musculomembranous tube which is divided into three parts, that is the nasopharynx, the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx, depending on the area which it is located. So the nasopharynx, which lies behind the nasal cavity, located at the level of C1. The oropharynx is that part of the pharynx which lies behind the oral cavity, as we can make out in this sagittal section. So this portion is the oropharynx, which lies at the level of C2 and C3, and beneath the oropharynx comes the laryngopharynx, which lies at the level of C4 and C5, and this laryngopharynx is seen behind the larynx. The laryngopharynx is directed downwards, where it is seen to be continuous with the esophagus at the level of the C6 vertebrae. Moving on to the oropharynx. When we talk about the oropharynx, as I have already told, oropharynx lies behind the oral cavity, and this oropharynx is also called as the mesopharynx. Yes, the oropharynx is also termed as the mesopharynx. So this oropharynx or the mesopharynx has got the anterior wall, it has got the posterior wall, it has got the floor and the lateral walls. So when we look about the anterior portion of the oropharynx, that is the anterior end of the oropharynx, the anterior wall or the anterior end of the oropharynx, as we can see in this picture, it is in continuation with the oral cavity, and it is separated from the oral cavity by the isthmus or the narrowed portion, which is called as the oropharyngeal isthmus. So the anteriorly, the oropharynx opens into the oral cavity through the isthmus, which is called as the oropharyngeal isthmus. This is the oropharyngeal isthmus. The oropharyngeal isthmus is limited above by the soft palate, as we can see over here. So this is the soft palate. It is limited below by the dorsal 1/3 of the tongue. It is limited below by the posterior or the dorsal 1/3 of the tongue, and on each side the oropharyngeal isthmus is bounded by the arch, which is the palatoglossal arch containing the corresponding muscle. So from the soft palate there is a mucosal arch which reaches the tongue, which reaches the glossae, called as the palatoglossal arch. So on either side, that is the lateral wall of this isthmus, is formed by the palatoglossal arch. So this is, and yes, the posterior wall or the dorsal wall of the oropharynx is at the level of the C2 and the C3 vertebrae, which is separated from the pharynx by the retropharyngeal space. So the posterior or the dorsal wall of the oropharynx is related to the second and the third cervical vertebrae, as well as the retropharyngeal space. So this is the diagrammatic view showing the parts of the pharynx. As we can see over here, this is the oropharynx, which is limited in front by the oropharyngeal isthmus, where it opens into the oral cavity. Behind, the oropharynx is related to the second and third cervical vertebrae. Here we can make out the oropharyngeal isthmus. As I have told, the oropharyngeal isthmus is limited above by the soft palate, below by the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, and on the either side by the palatoglossal fold. So this is the palatoglossal fold seen. So this is about the anterior and the posterior wall of the oropharynx. Moving on to the floor of the near the oropharynx. The floor of the oropharynx opens into the laryngopharynx at the level of the upper border of the epiglottis. Yes, at the level of the upper border of the epiglottis. Epiglottis lies begins the laryngopharynx. So the oropharynx is in continuation with the laryngopharynx below at the level of the upper border of the epiglottis. Upper border of the epiglottis. So this is about the floor of the oropharynx. When on either side, that is the lateral wall of the oropharynx is bounded by the tonsillar fossa. Yes, the lateral wall of the oropharynx here. This picture shows in detail about the lateral wall of the oropharynx. As we can see here, this is the area representing the lateral wall of the oropharynx, which is formed by the tonsillar fossa, as shown here. This tonsillar fossa holds the palatine tonsils within it. So this tonsillar fossa, which makes up the lateral wall of the oropharynx, is bounded in front by the palatoglossal arch. As we can see, it is bounded in front by the palatoglossal arch, it behind by the palatopharyngeal arch. So this is the palatoglossal arch, this is the palatoglossal arch in front, palatopharyngeal arch behind, and in between the two arches, that is the palatoglossal and palatopharyngeal arch, lies the fossa, within which lies the palatine tonsil, into which lies the palatine tonsil. This palatine tonsillar fossa is directed upwards where it forms the apex. The apex of the tonsillar fossa is formed by the meeting of the palatoglossal and the palatopharyngeal arch, whereas the base of the tonsillar fossa is formed by the posterior 1/3 of the base of the, that is, it is formed by the dorsal surface of the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. The dorsal surface of the posterior 1/3 of the tongue here makes up the base of the tonsillar fossa. So this is the tonsillar fossa, which contains the palatine tonsils. This makes up the lateral wall of the oropharynx. The lateral wall or the floor of the fossa, is formed by the superior constrictor and the styloglossus muscle. Yes, the lateral wall of the lateral wall of the tonsillar fossa, on which the palatine tonsil rests. This lateral wall or the floor of the fossa is formed by two muscles. One is the superior constrictor, muscle, and second is the styloglossus. Styloglossus muscle. So these two muscles make up the floor of the tonsillar fossa. They make up the floor of the tonsillar fossa. So this is about the oropharynx. Moving on to the laryngopharynx. As I have just now mentioned, the laryngopharynx begins as the continuation of the oropharynx, which lies at the level of C4 and C5 vertebrae. This is the diagrammatic view showing the oropharynx from its anterior end. As I have told, this is the tonsillar fossa, which is making up the lateral boundary of the oropharynx. The soft palate from the above, the tonsillar fossa, which is seen here lodging the palatine tonsils. So this fossa is formed in front by the palatoglossal arch, behind by the palatopharyngeal arch, the base of which is formed by the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, and apex is formed by the meeting of the two arches above. So this is the picture where we can have an easy idea about the tonsillar fossa. Next, moving on to the laryngopharynx. This laryngopharynx lies at the level of C4 and C5 cervical vertebrae and lies behind the larynx. It lies behind the larynx. So, this laryngopharynx is also known as the hypopharynx. The laryngopharynx is known as the hypopharynx. Hypopharynx. So the nasopharynx is termed as the epipharynx, the oropharynx is called as the mesopharynx, and the laryngopharynx is termed as the hypopharynx. This laryngopharynx is seen to extend from the upper border of the epiglottis. It is seen to extend from this point, that is the upper border of the epiglottis as shown here, till directed downwards to reach the lower border of the cricoid cartilage, till the lower border of the cricoid cartilage over here. So this is the extent of the laryngopharynx. So the laryngopharynx extends from the upper border of the epiglottis till the lower border of the cricoid cartilage, lies at the level of C4 and C5 cervical vertebrae. Moving on to the boundaries of this laryngopharynx, the laryngopharynx is bounded, it has got the anterior wall, it has got the posterior wall. Anterior wall of this laryngopharynx represents the laryngeal inlet, as we can make out here. Here is the laryngeal inlet where the laryngopharynx opens into the larynx. So this laryngeal inlet is limited on either side by the folds, that is the araepiglottic fold. So this is the araepiglottic fold. In front, the inlet is formed by the upper half of the epiglottis, and below, the inlet is formed by the interarytenoid fold of mucous membrane. So this is the laryngeal inlet. So anterior wall of the laryngopharynx is formed by the laryngeal inlet. Above and below, it is limited by the posterior part of the posterior surface of the arytenoid cartilage and the posterior lamina of the cricoid cartilage, which is covered by the fold of the mucous membrane. So all this anterior relation or the anterior wall, the structures making up the anterior wall of the laryngopharynx is seen here from above downwards. This is the laryngeal inlet. Then comes the two cartilages, that is the posterior surface of the arytenoid cartilage, which is seen here, and the posterior lamina of the cricoid cartilage. The cartilages are covered by the mucosal folds. So this make up the anterior wall of the laryngopharynx from above downwards. Posteriorly, the laryngopharynx lies at the level of the C4 and the C5 cervical vertebrae and the pre and paratracheal group of muscles. So this is about the anterior and the posterior wall of the laryngopharynx. Above, the laryngopharynx is opening into the oropharynx at the level of the upper border of the epiglottis, and below, the laryngopharynx opens into the esophagus at the level of the lower border of the cricoid cartilage, or at the level of C6. This is the opened posterior view showing the structures of which make up the relations of the laryngopharynx. As we can see over here, the laryngopharynx or the hypopharynx, which is exposed from the posterior side. This is the area of the laryngeal inlet, which is already been discussed. As I have already told you, the laryngeal inlet, which makes up the upper part of the anterior wall of the laryngopharynx, which is limited in front by the epiglottis, the uppermost part. Below, it is limited by the interarytenoid fold of the mucous membrane, on either side by the araepiglottic fold. So this entire thing which is seen is the laryngeal inlet, which opens into the larynx. So these structures are the anterior wall of the laryngopharynx. Posterior wall is been opened up, and on either side the laryngopharynx is covered by the mucous membrane. on either side of the laryngeal inlet. On each side of the laryngeal inlet lies the pyriform fossa. The on each side of the laryngeal inlet. This is the laryngeal inlet, as I have already told. On either side of the laryngeal inlet, the laryngopharynx is related to the pyriform fossa. The pyriform fossa is nothing but the deep mucosal depression which is present on either side, of the laryngeal inlet, which makes up the lateral relation of the laryngopharynx. This pyriform fossa is limited medially. It is limited medially by the araepiglottic fold. It is limited medially by the araepiglottic fold, and laterally it is limited. As we can see, laterally this pyriform fossa is limited by the inner surface of the thyroid lamina, the inner surface of the lamina of the thyroid cartilage, and this pyriform fossa is related above to the epiglottic valleculae. It is limited above to the epiglottic valleculae, which is seen here. This is the valleculae present on either side. So above this pyriform fossa is limited by the epiglottic valleculae, which is formed by the pharyngoepiglottic fold, as seen over here. So this is about the pyriform fossa. So pyriform fossa is the deep mucosal depression which is seen on the lateral wall of the laryngeal inlet. This pyriform fossa makes up the lateral relation of the laryngopharynx, and it is limited medially by the araepiglottic fold and laterally by the inner surface of the thyroid cartilage. Above, it is limited by the pharyngoepiglottic fold, which makes up the valleculae, and this pyriform fossa is important as this fossa is acting as the catch point of the foreign body. This pyriform fossa acts as the catch point of the foreign body, and the fossa is seen to be more deep in certain animals, and it acts as the lateral food channel during deglutition by the side of the closed laryngeal inlet. So the function of this pyriform fossa, in case of animals, it acts as the lateral food channel number 1, and also it acts as the catch point of the foreign body. Sometimes they say that the fossa is artificially deepened by the smugglers to hide the precious material from the eye of the public. So this is about the importance of the pyriform fossa. So we have discussed in detail about the laryngopharynx, the extent of the laryngopharynx, the location of the laryngopharynx, and the boundaries of the laryngopharynx, and also details about the pyriform fossa as well as the oropharynx also. So this is the end of the pharynx. So we have completed the pharynx in this video. Thank you.